Before we begin, find a quiet place, lower the lights, let the noise of the world fade. You're listening to Whispers of the World, where forgotten history breathes again. If you find yourself drawn to mysteries buried beneath time, consider subscribing. And now, let us begin. Long before history was written, before kings wore crowns, before gods had names, humanity looked up at the sky and wondered who came first. Not who ruled kingdoms, not who built empires, but who shaped us. There is a story older than the Bible, older than Egypt, older than the pyramids, stone circles, and temples carved into mountains. It comes from the land between two rivers, ancient Sumer, a civilization that appeared suddenly, fully formed. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, law, mythology, as if knowledge had been placed there. Among their earliest records, carved into clay tablets over 5,000 years ago, we find references to beings who were not human, yet not entirely divine in the way later religions would describe gods. They were called the Anunnaki. The name itself is ancient. Roughly translated, it means those who came from the heavens to the earth. The Sumerians did not worship the Anunnaki as distant, unknowable forces. They described them as present, physical, interacting with humanity, teaching, commanding, judging, and sometimes punishing. According to these texts, the Anunnaki were involved in the creation of humanity itself. Not through magic, not through prayer, but through design. In tablet after tablet, preserved in museums today, we read accounts of gods gathering in councils, debating the fate of mankind, discussing labor, obedience, and purpose. Humans were not described as the center of creation. They were described as workers. This alone raises an unsettling question. Why would the earliest civilization on Earth believe they were engineered, rather than divinely inspired? The Sumerians spoke openly of their gods. There was Anu, Lord of the Heavens; Enlil, authority of earth and command; Enki, the god of wisdom, creation, and forbidden knowledge. These were not abstract spirits. They had personalities, conflicts, rivalries. They argued. They disobeyed each other, they made mistakes, and sometimes they showed compassion for humanity. But as centuries passed, something changed. The names faded, the stories were rewritten, and the gods of Sumer were slowly absorbed, reframed, or erased. When later civilizations rose, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, the Anunnaki did not disappear, they were renamed. When the Hebrew texts were written, echoes of these beings returned, but under different titles: Watchers, Nephilim, Sons of God. In the book of Genesis, there is a strange passage, a few verses long, often ignored. It speaks of divine beings who descended to earth, who took human women, and produced offspring described as giants, men of renown. Why does this story exist? And why does it resemble Sumerian accounts written thousands of years earlier? Coincidence or inheritance? History, as we are taught it, is clean, organized, predictable. But ancient history is not. It is fragmented, contradictory, messy, and often uncomfortable. The Sumerian tablets were not discovered by priests or prophets. They were uncovered by archaeologists, dug from the earth, buried beneath sand for millennia. And when scholars began translating them in the 1800s, something troubling emerged. These texts did not fit neatly into modern religious frameworks. They spoke of creation through experimentation, of gods who required resources, of celestial wars, of floods sent not as moral judgments, but as population control. And perhaps most unsettling of all, They described knowledge that humanity should not possess. This is where silence begins. Because while museums display fragments of these tablets, while universities publish sanitized translations, entire sections remain debated, dismissed, or quietly ignored. And that brings us to a question few dare to ask. If these stories were harmless mythology, why were they not preserved openly? As Christianity spread across Europe, the old gods were condemned, temples destroyed, texts burned, languages forgotten. But not everything vanished. Some knowledge was not destroyed. It was collected. The early church did something remarkable. It gathered texts, not just Christian writings, but pagan manuscripts, forbidden philosophies, ancient histories, and it locked them away. Today, beneath Vatican City, lies one of the most restricted collections of documents on Earth. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, miles of shelves, documents that only select scholars may view, texts that are never digitized, records that predate Christianity itself. The Church says these archives exist to preserve history, but preservation is not the same as revelation. Here is the unsettling thought. What if the Church knows about the Anunnaki, not as gods, but as something else? Something that challenges the story of divine creation. Something that reframes humanity not as the first intelligent beings, but as the result of intervention. If such knowledge existed, would it be shared freely, or would it be sealed away for the good of humanity? Because belief is power, and origin stories shape civilizations. To tell humanity that it was created by gods is one thing. To suggest it was designed by advanced beings is another entirely. And this is where forbidden history truly begins. Not with proof, but with patterns. Ancient myths repeating the same themes across cultures. Gods descending from the sky. Humans created to serve. Knowledge restricted. Punishment for disobedience. Floods that erase civilizations. These stories exist in Sumer, in the Bible, in ancient India, in Mesoamerica, separated by oceans, united by narrative. Is it possible that these civilizations were remembering the same event through different lenses? Or were they all influenced by a shared source, one that later authorities sought to control? The Anunnaki may no longer be worshipped. Their temples are dust, their names half forgotten, but their story refuses to die, because it asks a question that history has never answered. Who were we before gods became invisible? And if the truth lies buried, not beneath sand, but behind locked doors, who decides when humanity is ready to know? End of chapter 1. Before gods had names, the Anunnaki and the birth of forbidden history. In the next chapter, we step into the silent corridors of the Vatican itself, into an archive where history is not erased, only hidden. There is a place on earth where history does not move forward. It waits. Behind locked doors, beneath stone corridors, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. At the very heart of Vatican City, beneath layers of marble and authority, lies one of the most restricted archives ever created by human hands, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries, it was known by another name, the Vatican Secret Archive. The word secret did not originally mean hidden, it meant private. But over time, privacy became mystery, and mystery became fear. This archive is not small. It stretches for more than 80 kilometers of shelving, millions of documents, letters from kings, records of excommunications, ancient maps, early biblical manuscripts, texts written in dead languages that few humans alive today can read. Some documents date back over 1,200 years. Others are believed to be far older, copied, preserved, translated, and recopied again and again. The Vatican says the archive exists to protect fragile texts, to preserve humanity's heritage. And that may be true, but preservation is not the same as access. Only a handful of scholars are allowed inside each year. They must apply. They must justify their request. They must agree to supervision. They may view only what they are permitted to see. No browsing, no wandering, no questions outside approved boundaries. And most importantly, they are never allowed to see everything. If the Church truly had nothing to hide, one question lingers. Why does access remain so tightly controlled in the modern age, when digitization could preserve and share these texts with the world? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what the Vatican says, but in what it never addresses. Throughout history, the Church has acted not only as a spiritual institution, but as a curator of narrative. It decided which Gospels were canon, which were heretical, which stories defined God, and which were erased. Entire texts were excluded from the Bible, the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. The Book of Enoch, for example, speaks openly of watchers, celestial beings who descended to earth, who taught forbidden knowledge, who altered humanity. This text was quoted by early Christians, referenced by church fathers, and then removed. Why? Because it described a world where divine beings were not perfect, where heavenly entities disobeyed, where knowledge was restricted not to protect humanity, but to control it, and control is the foundation of power. Now imagine this. If texts like Enoch survived outside the Bible, what else survived inside the archives? Ancient translations of Sumerian myths, early comparative studies between Mesopotamian gods and biblical figures, records from church scholars who noticed uncomfortable parallels. Because the Vatican did not exist in ignorance, it existed in scholarship. Early church leaders were among the most educated people of their time. They studied Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic. Some even studied ancient Mesopotamian texts, long before modern archaeology rediscovered them. They knew the myths, they saw the similarities, and they understood the implications. If the God of Genesis resembled earlier gods, if creation stories overlapped, if humanity's origin narrative was inherited rather than revealed, then divine authority itself could be questioned, and questions are dangerous. Throughout the Middle Ages, knowledge was filtered, not destroyed entirely, but reframed. Pagan gods became demons, ancient heroes became myths, celestial beings became angels, and stories of gods walking among humans were reinterpreted as allegory, symbol, metaphor. But symbolism only works if no one checks the source. In the early 20th century, when Sumerian tablets were fully translated, scholars noticed something unsettling. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh predated Noah by thousands of years. The creation of humans from clay appeared long before Genesis, and the divine councils of the Anunnaki resembled the heavenly councils described in biblical texts. These discoveries were public, but their implications were quietly dismissed, not denied, dismissed. Because acknowledging them would force a question no institution built on faith once asked: where did the story really begin? The Vatican has never officially commented on the Anunnaki. No denial, no discussion, no engagement, silence. And silence is often louder than rejection. Within the archives, there are rumored classifications, documents labeled non-consultabile, not consultable, texts deemed too sensitive, too disruptive, too premature. Historians who have entered the archives speak carefully. Their words are measured. They describe an overwhelming sense of gravity, of being surrounded by truths, but never allowed to touch them. One scholar described it as standing inside humanity's memory, with most of it locked. Imagine discovering evidence that changes how people see God, humanity, itself. Would you release it, or would you decide the world is not ready? The Church has survived for nearly 2,000 years. Empires rose and fell around it. Kings bowed to it. Nations feared it, not because of armies, but because it controlled meaning. If the Anunnaki were real beings, if humanity was shaped by something beyond Earth, if ancient gods were misunderstood visitors rather than divine creators, then the Church's role shifts dramatically. It becomes not the messenger of God, but the editor of history, and editors choose what remains and what is cut. This does not mean the Vatican is evil, or deceptive, or malicious. It means it is human, and humans fear chaos. A revelation that rewrites human origins would not just challenge religion. It would challenge identity, purpose, hierarchy. Who are we, if we were not created as the final intention? Who do we pray to, if gods once walked among us? And what happens to faith when mystery becomes memory? Perhaps that is why the archives remain closed, not to hide the truth forever, but to delay it. Because once a story is released, it cannot be returned to silence. And some truths, once known, change everything. End of Chapter 2. The Vatican Archives, where history goes to disappear, in the next chapter. We will trace the echoes between Sumerian gods, biblical watchers, and a shared ancient story that refuses to stay buried. History rarely disappears. It changes its clothes. When ancient civilizations fell, their stories did not vanish with them. They were translated, renamed, absorbed into new belief systems. And nowhere is this more visible than in the strange similarities between the oldest myths of Sumer and the sacred texts that followed thousands of years later. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki. The Bible speaks of angels, watchers, and sons of God. Different words, strikingly similar roles. In Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki descend from the heavens. In Genesis, the sons of God come down to earth. In Sumer, gods take interest in human women. In the Book of Enoch, watchers do the same. In Sumer, humanity is created to labor. In Genesis, humanity is cursed to toil the land. These are not identical stories, but they rhyme, and rhymes in history are rarely accidental. The Book of Enoch is key to understanding this pattern. It was written centuries before Christianity. It was widely read in the ancient world. It was even quoted directly in the New Testament. Yet today, it is missing from most Bibles. Enoch describes watchers, celestial beings tasked with observing humanity. But some of them rebel. They descend to earth. They teach humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, writing. These gifts are not portrayed as blessings. They are portrayed as transgressions. Why? Because knowledge creates independence, and independence threatens authority. In Enoch, the watchers are punished not simply for desire, but for educating humanity beyond its assigned limits. This echoes a much older Sumerian theme. In Sumerian mythology, Enki, the god of wisdom, repeatedly defies the authority of Enlil. He warns humanity of the coming flood. He teaches them skills. He preserves life. Enki is not evil. but he is dangerous, dangerous to order. In the Bible, this same archetype appears again, but under a new name: the serpent, a bringer of knowledge, a challenger of divine restriction, a figure condemned not for destruction, but for enlightenment. Is it possible that the serpent was not a symbol of evil, but a memory of a forbidden teacher? Across cultures, the same figure appears: Prometheus, who gives fire to humanity; Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brings knowledge; Oans, the fish god who teaches civilization. They are punished, exiled, demonized, but never forgotten. Why do cultures separated by oceans describe the same story? A divine being, teaching humanity against the will of higher authority. Either these civilizations invented the same myth independently, or they were remembering something real. Through myth, ancient texts are not scientific records. They are human memories, filtered through belief, preserved through story. And when stories become inconvenient, they are rewritten. The early church faced a problem: too many similarities between pagan myths and biblical narratives, too many overlapping gods, too many shared events. So a decision was made. One version would become truth, the others would become fiction. Gods became angels, angels became demons, ancient engineers became allegories, the Watchers became fallen, the Anunnaki became myths, but the structure remained: divine councils, forbidden knowledge, punishment by flood, humanity reset. The flood story alone appears in more than 200 ancient cultures, from Sumer to the Bible, to the Americas, to Asia. Different names, same catastrophe. If this were pure myth, why is the memory so persistent? Sumerian tablets describe a flood sent to reduce humanity's noise. Biblical texts describe a flood sent to cleanse corruption. Different justification, same result. Could this be the same event remembered differently? Or was the flood a tool, used more than once? These questions were not welcomed by religious authorities. They threatened uniqueness, divine exclusivity, and uniqueness is central to faith. If God was not the first to create, if angels once walked physically among humans, if knowledge was once restricted, then humanity's relationship with the divine becomes complicated. This is why some texts were removed, not because they were false, but because they were too revealing. The Book of Enoch was not heretical in content. It was heretical in implication. It suggested that divine beings could fall, that knowledge could be stolen, that humanity was once part of a larger cosmic hierarchy, and perhaps that we were not meant to remember. The Vatican never banned Enoch publicly. It simply stopped copying it. Silence is often more effective than censorship. Over generations, the text faded, except in Ethiopia, where it survived. Why there? Because distance protects memory. As archaeology advanced, scholars began to notice these patterns again. But by then, the narrative was already fixed. Religion had become identity. Challenging it meant exile, ruin, death. So scholars spoke carefully. They used words like mythological overlap, cultural transmission, symbolic convergence. But the pattern remained: different cultures, same story, same warning. Knowledge changes power, and power decides history. If the Anunnaki were not gods, but beings remembered as gods, then the Watchers were not angels, but watchers, observers, teachers, and humanity was not the center of creation, but a participant in a larger story, a story someone decided was too dangerous to tell fully. End of chapter 3. Erased pages, Sumerian gods, biblical watchers, and the same ancient story. In the next chapter, We will look not at texts, but at symbols, hidden in plain sight, etched into stone, painted into sacred art, symbols that never speak, but never lie. Not all knowledge is written in words. Some truths are hidden in stone, in paint, in silence. Long after ancient texts were buried, burned, or forgotten, symbols remained. Walk through the great cathedrals of Europe. Stand beneath their towering ceilings. Look closely, not at what is preached, but at what is depicted. Strange figures stare down from stained glass windows, winged beings with unfamiliar faces, creatures that look less like angels and more like watchers. Why do some angels resemble beings from older myths? Why do halos sometimes look like discs, or radiant circles, or something else entirely? Art is not created accidentally, especially not sacred art. Medieval artists were not free to imagine. They followed instruction, approved imagery, authorized symbolism. So when unusual elements appear again and again, we should ask why. In some Renaissance paintings, God is shown surrounded by a glowing oval, an almond-shaped form, known as a mandorla. To theologians, it represents divine light, but to others, it resembles something more physical, a vessel, a boundary, a presence. In one famous painting, The Creation of Adam, God is depicted inside a shape strikingly similar to the human brain. Scholars debate whether this was intentional, but the resemblance is undeniable. Was this symbolism or something else? Throughout Vatican architecture, there are celestial references, star maps, zodiac imagery, cosmic alignments. The Church has always denied astrology, yet it preserved astronomical knowledge with precision. Why preserve the sky? If the sky holds no importance? In ancient Sumer, gods were associated with specific planets: Anu, the heavens; Enlil, the atmosphere; Enki, the waters and earth. The same planetary symbolism appears later, in Christian iconography. Coincidence or inheritance? Symbols are safer than words. They can be explained away, reinterpreted, ignored, but they endure. Even language hides memory. The word angel comes from the Greek angelos, messenger, not deity, not creator. Messengers imply senders. Who sent them? Early Christian art depicted angels without wings. Wings were added later. Why? Because wings create distance. They make beings seem less physical, less present. Older depictions show angels as men, tall, radiant, terrifying, much like the watchers described in Enoch. The Church eventually softened these images, turned angels into gentle figures, comforting, harmless, because fear invites questions, and questions lead backward. In Vatican vaults, there are artifacts rarely discussed: stone relics, ancient seals, uncatalogued items. Some historians believe these objects predate Christianity. They were not destroyed. They were absorbed. When Rome conquered cultures, it did not erase them completely. It rebranded them. Pagan temples became churches. Sacred dates became holy days. Gods became saints. This was not deception. It was strategy. People accept new beliefs more easily when they resemble the old. If ancient beings were once worshipped, it was easier to rename them than to deny them. This may explain why certain symbols persist: serpents, wheels, eyes. The all-seeing eye appears across cultures: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Christianity. An eye that watches, observes, judges. Why does a monotheistic faith preserve such imagery? Because memory resists erasure. Some Vatican scholars have quietly acknowledged that early Christianity absorbed earlier traditions, but absorption requires selection. What was kept and what was locked away? In the Sistine Chapel, prophets and sibyls appear together. Biblical figures alongside pagan seers. Why include them? Because knowledge was not exclusive, it was inherited, and inheritance carries history. The Church often says symbols are metaphor, but metaphor comes from something real. No one invents complex symbolism without reference. Symbols are compression. They hide meaning in plain sight. If the Anunnaki were remembered, but could not be named, symbols became their refuge, not proof, not evidence, but echoes. And echoes are dangerous, because they lead listeners back to the source. The Vatican does not deny these symbols. It does not explain them. It simply lets them exist. Perhaps because explanation would require admission, and admission would raise the final question. If humanity once encountered beings greater than itself, what are we now? End of chapter 4. Coded symbols and silent witnesses. What the Church never explains. In the final chapter, we will confront the most unsettling possibility, not what the Vatican knows, but why the truth might remain hidden. There is a reason some truths arrive quietly, because when they arrive loudly, they shatter everything. Imagine for a moment that the oldest stories are not myths, not metaphors, but memories, not remembered clearly, but remembered honestly. What if the Anunnaki were not gods in the modern sense, not divine creators, but beings remembered as gods, because humanity had no other language to describe them? Advanced, powerful, unreachable. To ancient humans, there was no difference between technology and magic, no distinction between science and divinity. If something descended from the sky, if it commanded nature, if it altered life itself, it became a god. Now imagine what it would mean if humanity learned that its origin story was incomplete, not false, incomplete, that we were not created in a single moment, but shaped over time, guided, modified, watched, that our myths are not fantasies, but distorted reflections of real encounters. Such a revelation would not simply affect religion, it would affect identity. Who are we, if we were not alone at the beginning? Who decides morality, if our teachers were not divine absolutes, but flawed beings with agendas? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what if they never left? Ancient texts do not always say the gods vanished. Sometimes they say they withdrew, returned to the heavens, went silent. Silence does not mean absence. If the Anunnaki were real, or if beings like them existed, then humanity may not be waiting for first contact, but remembering the last. This possibility terrifies institutions, not because it destroys faith, but because it decentralizes authority. If God was not singular, if knowledge was once restricted, if humanity was once managed, then truth becomes shared, not owned. Religions are built on certainty, on answers, on structure. But ancient history offers questions, and questions destabilize power. This may explain why certain knowledge is delayed, not erased, delayed. Perhaps the Vatican does not see itself as hiding truth, but protecting humanity from shock, because belief systems collapse slowly, but revelation happens instantly. If tomorrow undeniable evidence emerged, what would happen? Some would lose faith, others would deepen it. Some would panic, others would feel relief. Humanity would fracture before it could rebuild, and rebuilding requires time. So maybe the truth is not locked away forever. Maybe it is being paced, released slowly, through archaeology, through astronomy, through genetics, one discovery at a time, so that when the full picture emerges, It feels inevitable, not catastrophic. Perhaps that is why ancient stories were preserved at all. Not destroyed, not erased, preserved. Because someone believed humanity would eventually be ready. Ready to understand that gods were not perfect, that creation was not clean, that history is layered, and that humanity's story is far older and far stranger than we were taught. The Anunnaki, whether real beings or symbolic ancestors, represent something profound. They represent the moment humanity realized it was not alone, and that realization has never fully left us. It lives in our stories, our fears, our longing for the stars. Why do we look upward when we ask questions about origin? Why do we search the sky for meaning? Because memory pulls us there, not consciously, but instinctively. If the Vatican knows something, it may not be a single secret, but a responsibility. The responsibility of holding a truth until humanity stops fearing it. Until the question is no longer, will this destroy belief? But instead, what does this teach us about ourselves? Because the most dangerous truth is not that gods existed, but that humans may have been shaped, not to obey, but to remember. Thank you for listening to Whispers of the World. If these mysteries speak to you, if questions linger, then you are already part of the story. Sleep well, and remember, history does not disappear, it waits.